Hello everyone, in this lesson we'll be dealing with literary devices. We will discuss what they are, why writers use them, and why we should learn about them. And I'll briefly explain what I consider to be the most important devices you will need to know, especially during the course of this subject. So what do we understand by literary devices? They are techniques or certain structures writers use for different purposes. It goes without saying that these devices are a way to embellish the text. They are intended to make writing more appealing, so that would be using them for an aesthetic purpose. They can be used to create special effects on the reader, thus getting the reader to more strongly connect with the story. They are also used to convey information, be it ideas the writer would like the reader to understand, or emotions he would like the reader to experience. Other reasons a literary device can be used can be to help us better understand the work and connect with the reader on another level. All these hidden intentions by the author to make his piece of writing get to the reader make it essential, especially for future translators, to know them and be able to identify them. As translators, you will have the enormous task of transferring all these intentions, meanings, purposes the author has into another language, while being faithful to the original. So now let's plunge into some of these devices to better understand them. The first device I've chosen is the epigraph, which is a short quotation, usually in the form of a phrase, sentence, poem, or extract from another piece of writing, generally by another author. Epigraphs can be used for a number of purposes, but they are most frequently used to suggest the theme of the work, or to set the tone, whether by contrasting the two books or by simply showing the reader their similarity. For instance, one of the most celebrated lines from the novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is "Mr. Kurtz, he dead," and it was used as an epigraph in T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men to suggest that modern people had dead souls, much as the character of Kurtz in Heart of Darkness. The next device is flash forward, also known as prolepsis, which occurs when the plot gets interrupted and the narrative moves forward in time. It is usually used when the author wants to shed light on the character's actions. A clear and very famous example in literature can be found in Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, when the main character Scrooge experiences a flash forward when he is visited by the ghost of Christmas future. Another example would be the following lines from Keats' poem Isabella. "So the two brothers and their murdered man rode past fair Florence." These lines show a future event, as the murdered man is Lorenzo, who will be murdered later on in the story by Isabella's two brothers. The opposite of flash forward or prolepsis would be the device called flashback or analepsis, which is used to describe any scene in a play, novel, story, or poem, which is inserted to show events that happened at an earlier time in the narrative present. They are usually introduced as past narratives, dreams, memories, among others. This is considered a very cinematic technique and is most often used to convey information regarding the character's background. This example comes from the beginning of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad again, when the main character, Charles Marlowe, decides to tell the sailors there with him about his experience traveling in the center of Africa to find an ivory trader named Kurtz. Then the narration unfolds, so we can say that the bulk of Conrad's novel occurs actually in a flashback. Some of the most common devices in literature are the metaphor and the simile. They are both used to compare two generally unlike things. The difference between them is basically that with similes you use connecting words, such as like or as. These devices not only help the reader imagine the fictive world of literature in a clearer way, but it even helps better understand the world around us. The next device is oxymoron, which is the combination of two elements that seem to be opposites, but that in closer connection we realize it contains an implied truth. For instance, in this example from The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, the juxtaposition of the words believing and incredible makes us readers have the impression that this phrase is contradictory, but in closer inspection it actually makes sense, meaning that this character will believe anything that cannot be believed, usually by the rest of the people. This adds comedy to the line, one of the reasons oxymorons are used. However, by contrasting seemingly opposing objects or concepts, they also make the reader think more deeply about the multiple meanings of existence. Irony is very much used as a literary device. There are three types of irony: verbal, situational, and dramatic. In the case of verbal irony, this is when the speaker says something which is in sharp contrast to what he really means. Such is the case of Othello in this example, which refers to Iago ironically as wise, when that's the opposite of what he actually thinks of him. Then there's situational irony, which consists of something that happens which is the opposite of what we would have expected in that situation. In the case of the example by Coleridge, the irony comes from the fact that the character, a castaway in the middle of the ocean, is thirsty, and he can see there is so much water but none that he can drink, because it's salty and he would die. Finally, the third type is dramatic irony, which is when the audience knows what is happening or about to happen, but not the character in the story. For instance, in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo is about to commit suicide in order to be with Juliet, the audience knows that Juliet is not actually dead and that he's killing himself for nothing. The next literary device, which will come in handy when we discuss modernism, especially James Joyce, is epiphany. That moment of illumination in which a character realizes some truth, suddenly becomes aware of a certain situation or knowledge. I mentioned James Joyce because he was a master at using this device, and in his collection of short stories entitled Dubliners, there is an epiphanic moment in nearly all the stories. In one of those, Evelyn, the main character is considering leaving his abusive home to go to America with her lover Frank. However, near the end of the story, she has an epiphany, in which she realizes that she should not do so, and that's the example I've chosen. In this particular case, the epiphany is a sign of the conclusion of the story. At other times, this device can have the purpose of pointing out a turning point in the plot, or can make the reader change his or her mind about a certain character. Last but not least, there is symbolism, which occurs when we imbue an object with symbolic meanings which are different from their literal sense. In this example from To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, mockingbirds stand for innocent people who are harmed. Symbols are very interesting as they add layers of meaning to a story, allowing the author to deliver messages on multiple levels. All this, of course, helps the reader better understand the work. So I hope this brief explanation of some of the most important literary devices help you to find many more examples, especially in the texts we'll be dealing with throughout the term. Thank you for listening.